This giant statue in the Soviet Union commemorates one of the most decisive battles of the Second World War. September 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad begins. In June 1941, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, meeting little resistance at first, but by mid-1942, at Leningrad, the Russians stopped their advance. And at Moscow, the Germans were forced back. Now they attacked in the south, aiming at Stalingrad, the great industrial center. Hitler's orders were to capture the city, Stalin's to defend it at all costs. The fighting went on in the bitter winter for nearly 5 months. Though the Russians fiercely defended the city, the Germans occupied nearly all of it. It seemed they'd won the battle. But Stalin had sent this man, General Zhukov, giving him special powers. Zhukov, the hero of the Battle of Moscow, was determined to defeat the Germans. His plan was simple. He built up his forces to the north and south of the city and attacked, trapping the German Sixth Army of nearly 250,000 men. The Russians offered the Germans the chance to surrender. But the Sixth Army had been forbidden by Hitler himself to surrender or even to break out. They must continue the fight for Stalingrad. So the Russians attacked. The Germans could only supply their trapped army by air. But the Russians shot down the planes and destroyed their airfields. Much of the desperately needed supplies never got through. About 70,000 Germans died during the battle, many from starvation and exposure. In February 1943, the Germans were finally forced to surrender, and the Russians took over the city. The Germans were rounded up, and over 90,000 were taken prisoner, including 24 generals and their commander, Field Marshal von Paulus. In London, the Russian victory was acclaimed by the British Foreign Secretary.
We, as representative of the British people, pay tribute to every department of the Red Army. Never in all its long, proud history has the German army sustained such an unmitigated disaster as the Red Army has inflicted upon it in the Battle of Stalingrad.
But in Berlin, it was a time for mourning. Now the Russians began to drive the enemy back. Throughout the summer of 1943, they hammered the Germans in a series of huge tank battles. They were supplied by factories deep inside the Soviet Union. Some had been built before the war under Stalin's 5-year plans, but many were set up during the war. To escape the German advance, masses of machinery, millions of workers, mainly women, old men and boys, had been moved far to the east beyond the Urals. The British and Americans also sent weapons and equipment by the dangerous Arctic sea route. In spite of heavy losses, they supplied nearly 500,000 badly needed lorries and tanks. But for Stalin, this was not enough. He wanted Britain and America to set up a second front by attacking Hitler's Europe in the west. In 1943, at Tehran, in Iran, the three Allied leaders met for the first time. After Stalin had been given a sword in honor of Stalingrad, they got down to business. Churchill and Roosevelt now definitely promised Stalin to open a second front by 1944.
The enemy must be hit and hit hard from so many directions that he will never know which is his bow and which is his stern.
In fact, the British and Americans had already invaded Sicily and Italy to attack Hitler's Europe in the south. The Italians quickly surrendered, and Allied bombers from the captured airbase at Foggia could now attack Germany and the Balkans. But the Germans quickly moved south, and the war in Italy became hard and slow. Rome didn't fall until June 1944. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the British and Americans bombed Germany and the occupied countries. They attacked Germany by day and night. In 1943, the American General Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces preparing for the Second Front. General Montgomery was one of his deputies. Immense numbers of war supplies and men were built up and crammed into southeast England, ready for the invasion of Hitler's Europe. Meanwhile, Hitler had put Field Marshal Rommel in command of the German armies preparing for the Allied invasion. No one knew where it was to be, so he had to keep his army spread out.
This is London. London calling in the home, overseas and European services of the BBC and through United Nations Radio Mediterranean. This is John Snagg speaking. Communique number 1. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. I repeat that communique. Communique number 1. Under the command of General Eisenhower.
The Allies attacked. The Germans resisted. But gradually they were pushed back, and the Allied forces began their advance through occupied France, supported by vast supplies landed from the famous Mulberry floating harbours. Again, the Germans managed to hold up the Allies at Falaise, but the town was destroyed and all German troops killed or captured. Now the Allies could spread across Normandy with little to stop them. On August the 24th, 1944, Paris was liberated. The Free French entered their capital in triumph. Their leader, de Gaulle, soon established himself as head of the French provisional government. To many people it seemed that the war would be over by the end of the year, but it was not to be. The Germans struck back. They attacked London with the first of their terror weapons, the V-1, a small, fast, pilotless jet plane difficult to shoot down. It carried 1 ton of explosives. In London and the southeast, during June 1944, casualties were as high as they'd been during the Blitz in September 1940. There was also the V-2 rocket. Reaching a speed of over 5,500 km, it could deliver its 1 ton of explosives without warning. There was no defense against it. Then at Arnhem in Holland in September 1944, the British suffered a major defeat. Over 12,000 men had been dropped by air to capture a bridge over the Rhine 8 miles away. But the Germans' strength had been seriously underestimated, and after a week's fierce fighting, outnumbered and outgunned, the British failed to capture the bridge and had to surrender. Then, in a surprise attack in the Ardennes, in December 1944, the Germans, helped by the winter conditions, drove over 90 kilometers into the Allies to split the advancing British and American armies. The battle held them up for a month. In the east, the Russians were just outside Warsaw. They'd already occupied Romania, Bulgaria, and part of Yugoslavia. Budapest was threatened by two armies. The Russians were now set on the road to Berlin. In Warsaw, on the 1st of August 1944, the Polish Home Army rose against the Germans. They did this under the orders of their exiled government in London, who wanted to get control of the city. They captured half the city, but couldn't defeat the Germans without Allied help. The Russians waited on the outskirts. Meanwhile, the Poles lost thousands of men, women and children. In the end, they had to surrender to the Germans, who'd won back control of the city. After that, the Germans destroyed Warsaw. On New Year's Day 1945, the Russians entered the city. At Lublin, they'd already installed a committee of hand-picked communists who later became the pro-Soviet government of the new Poland. The Germans were now in full retreat, destroying everything they could to try and slow down the Russian advance. One by one, the towns of Eastern Europe saw the red flag flying from their buildings. In February 1945, at Yalta, a Russian seaside resort on the Black Sea, the now victorious Allies, Britain, America and Russia, met to plan the final stages of the war and the future frontiers of Europe. Roosevelt was a dying man. Started his influence and power. In the West, the Allies were now ready for the final assault on Germany. They crossed the Rhine in March 1945. Churchill, the British Prime Minister, came to join the Allied troops on German soil. To his amazement, Eisenhower decided not to race the Russians to Berlin. In spite of Churchill's arguments, he insisted on capturing the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. The Germans now prepared for the last-ditch defense of their capital, Berlin. Young and old were forced to enlist in the People's Home Guard. They waited for the Russian tanks. By the middle of April 1945, Zhukov's tanks were inside Berlin. Street by street, building by building, the Germans were forced back. Hitler killed himself on the 30th of April 1945. 2 days later, the Russians planted their flag in the heart of his Germany. On the River Elbe, 100 kilometers south of Berlin, the first meeting of the American and Russian troops took place. It was all very friendly. On May the 8th, 1945, the German surrender was announced by Churchill.
The representative of the German High Command and Admiral Dönitz signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight Tuesday, the 8th of May, we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
Victory in Europe was celebrated in the Allied city. But the end of the war revealed the full horror of Nazi rule. In concentration camps, 6 million Jews had died. There was a dark side to the Allied victory too. Those who'd collaborated with the Germans were publicly humiliated. Or worse. Hitler's Third Reich, intended to last 1,000 years, lay in ruins, just 12 years after he'd come to power. Occupied Europe had suffered too. Meanwhile, the military leaders of the victorious Allied powers met in Berlin on June the 5th, 1945. They'd come to make arrangements for the administration of an occupied and divided Germany.